to be able to be here. I haven't visited for a couple of years. It's nice to see old friends sitting in the audience, so it's really good to have this opportunity to be here. I will note, just in passing, it's particularly nice to be here on a day when apparently it is colder and rainier and grayer in Los Angeles than it is in Seattle. My wife just texted me to say some sudden thunderstorm had rolled in. I'm like, oh, it's lovely here. The work I want to talk about today is part of an ongoing project. If you were lucky, you would not be hearing about it from me. You'd be hearing about it from my colleague Leah Horgan, PhD student working with me who's been doing the ethnographic work on this project. You are unlucky, so you're hearing about it from me. At some occasion, you will get to hear about it from her, I hope. And it's a project that's been going on for 2.5 years at this point, but continues because, like many ethnographic projects, it continues to evolve. And it is inspired not least by the situation that we all find ourselves in, whereby certain kinds of terms that perhaps in computer science or information science or science in general we felt were our terms of art, like data and algorithm, have suddenly become objects of public discourse, the sorts of things over which we might be quizzed at Thanksgiving dinner, the sorts of things for which we have to account in new kinds of ways. And so we were intrigued as to what that might be. And then the particular context within which we've been doing this is around urban governance. David alluded to smart cities. That's one of a number of terms that people will use. But more broadly, the notion that data has become not only a tool for scientific inquiry, but also a tool for civic inquiry, and therefore also, in fact, a site of civic engagement. If one is expected to engage with the city, with our sort of civic infrastructures and institutions in terms of technology and data, we wanted to ask the questions about what that means, what it looks like, what it enables, for whom it works, for whom it does not, and so forth. So data is being sort of put forward here, as you will see, as a way for citizens to engage with government, particularly urban government, and for government to know of and speak to its citizenry. So yeah, the smart city rhetoric is certainly one of the most prominent that's sort of part of this constellation. I don't know about you. For me, when I think about smart city rhetoric is often a rhetoric of a sensor-rich urban environment, one that is available for real-time monitoring and real-time control, one in which data can be gathered so that city services can be delivered more promptly, more efficiently, in a more targeted manner, more accurately, and so forth. But it's not critically the only one of these rhetorics at which data is formulated this way. In fact, as I'll say, the group that we've been dealing with, although they do smart city stuff, were initially constituted around an argument of open data. Not so much that the city could be generating new kinds of data, but rather an argument that the city already had lots of data and it should be available to its citizens, as well as simply to its administrators. And so you were all familiar with sort of transparency initiatives, sunlight initiatives that attempt to open up the bureaucracy of urban governance to new kinds of scrutiny from the citizenry, and data is at the heart of certain versions, certain kind of like rhetorical structures there. So the idea that data is actually already present and needs to be opened up is another element of this sort of data as a tool of urban governance. And then the third that I'll point to here, which now that I think about it, it was more prominent perhaps when we started than it has been of late, is this notion of sort of civic hacking that data and data platforms are a site at which the city may be able to take advantage of the creativity of its citizens, may be able to engage them in problem solving, might be able to, rely upon citizen innovation in order to make up for presumably a lack of urban innovation. I don't know, wherever the gaps are that are meant to be filled. But there's this sort of notion of outreach and the sort of and creativity associated with the generation of all kinds of apps for city services and the rest of it. And you can think back to the National Day of Civic Hacking under the Obama administration and other kinds of things of the long lost past. All three of these rhetorics are sort of bound together in different kinds of ways in different kinds of places. All three of them are concerns for the particular group with whom we have been working and that has been the site for our ethnographic research. So this is the Los Angeles City Hall in LA downtown. LA does actually have a downtown. It's a well-kept secret, but there is one. And in 2013, when the current mayor Eric Garcetti was elected, one of the earliest things he did was to set up a team known just simply at the time as the data team, which was going to be engaged in these various kinds of projects, particularly around the open data stuff. He'd actually run on a platform of using technology and using data to make city service delivery more efficient, but also one of these sort of transparency things to say we were going to open up the city's data to scrutiny to allow people to see that they were getting value for money, whether there was bias or unfair or discrimination in the delivery of services and so forth. And so that had been part of the platform upon which he had been elected and which he had campaigned. And I'm going to come back a little bit later to the question of what it might mean for these kinds of things to move from a campaign to city government. So Garcetti is still the mayor. These initiatives still continue. The data team is no longer called the data team, but I'm going to continue to call them the data team because otherwise I'll get confused. But the situation has transformed itself in a whole variety of ways that I'll sort of try to step through. Let's take that term, the data team, which seems straightforward but is not, and it is not in three separate ways. And once I show you what the first one is, the second two will become obvious. So the first way it's not obvious is in terms of what data might mean here. Whose data, where it comes from, what it means to be driven by data, how recent data can be, how data gets defined, who owns, manages, and is responsible for data, if it's going to be made available to people, where it needs to be located, whether that's a shift in administrative control or not. That turns out that data is not so straightforward and obvious here. Data is located all over the city, and the very fact that it's located all over the city makes things really difficult for a group called the data team because they can't take responsibility for all of it. For, again, reasons that will become more clear. And not everything that the city has as data, or at least in its data systems, is necessarily data in the form that it can be made available to citizens. So it turns out there's a lot of complexity around quite what this notion of data might be, which is, for instance, different from information, which is the responsibility of a different group in this city. So the wisdom team has yet to be constituted. The word team itself also complicated. So the data team comprises, so that just gives you some sort of broad sort of sense. Population, the city of Los Angeles is about 4 million people. the city government of Los Angeles employs about 40,000 people, the data team comprises roughly 4 people. The data team depends on a lot of volunteer labor. The data team depends on a lot of students from UCLA and USC and UC Irvine and other places, Cal State LA and so forth. A lot of people on fellowships from the Ford Foundation or the Knight Foundation or other groups. There is actually a large cast of characters who continually move through the data team space, but the data team itself is actually very small. The idea, again, if data is distributed all over the city, then the idea of having one team that's responsible for it is also something of a problem. But in fact, it's an area where membership in the data team is not entirely clear. In fact, when I was talking with Leah at some point about just the numbers, it was actually only in the course of going through it that she realized that amongst the 4, she was counting herself. This was because, as an ethnographer, she was like turning up. You know, she was there 2 to 3 days a week for the full workday and had been doing that for several years. So everybody just regarded her as part of the team, as indeed a senior member of the team, because she'd been around for so much longer than other people. Because one of the things when you have a rotating cast of characters drawn from, you know, the student populations of various places, people turn up for a semester or for a quarter or maybe for a year or maybe just until they get bored. Or find something better to do, some paid employment, for example. And so the boundaries of the team are themselves continually in flux and indeed ambiguous even to people who are members of the team and certainly people who are adjacent. You can tell, I think, what my third problem is going to be, which is the word the team was constituted as the data team, as I said, in 2013. And what was fairly clear that they were the people who were responsible for making good on the campaign promises that Mayor Garcetti had made and on the initiatives that they had wanted to put in place. It was sort of fairly clearly located. One of the things, however, that's happened since 2013 is, as I said, intimated at the beginning, that the term data has become ever more current. The term data has become ever more relevant and very, prominent, with the result that many other people feel that data is also their business. And indeed, what would it be to be in business of the business of being the city without being grounded in data? So everyone's doing data. Leah came into the office one day to find posters adorning the lobby for the monthly Data and Donuts workshop that they wanted to, or morning that they wanted to hold, except that it wasn't the data team who were running the Data and Donuts workshop. This was the first time they had ever heard of it. It was actually the corporate information officer's office who had decided that data should really be more their concern, and that they wanted to make their position clear and their very presence clear, and we're going to do it by essentially grabbing the label data. Indeed, now it turns out, it's largely evolved so that there are data teams in each of the different departments of government, right? From the police and the school district. Actually, the school district technically in LA, not under the mayor's control, not part of government, it's different, but, and sanitation and parks and parking and, all the different kinds of things that cities do. So it turns out there's a lot of competition, a sort of contest for the very term of data. And I say a contest for the term of data because this contest is actually manifest more around the term than it is around, large CSV files on servers. It's not really about numbers. It is about ownership and authority. One of my colleagues at Irvine is an organizational sociologist, a very prominent organizational sociologist called Martha Feldman. Martha has a paper that she wrote with Jim March back in the 80s, entitled "Information as Signal and Symbol in Organizations." And it sort of starts Well, it starts with a sort of like, a Herb Simony kind of premise, right? If we think about organizations as information processing devices, then it means that organized institutions gather information in order to make decisions. It costs them money and effort to gather information, so there must be a decision that's important enough that it's worth the cost of gathering the data. And then once the decision is made, you would stop gathering data because the decision's made, right? None of these things are actually true, as we know. All sorts of data is collected for all sorts of purposes that have nothing to do with decisions that are even vaguely on the horizon. People collect data because it's there. People collect data because they've got nothing better to do. Once the decision is made, people keep on gathering data because I've already established this, like I've already set up my scripts to download this stuff, right? And anyway, everybody knows that the person who walks into the room with the most data wins. Right? That's how you win arguments. That's how you marshal resources. It's how you make things happen in an organization. Martha and Jim were talking about this in the context of like information because I don't know, it was 1986, whatever. But because we see exactly the same thing happening now with data. Data is power, not in the sense, well, maybe and potentially in the sense that knowing things is a powerful position and having data allows you to offer certain kind of interpretations. But just being able to have the data, have data at all, any data, and being able to show it off. When I worked at Soros Park, there used to be a guy, I don't know, he turned up in almost every meeting. It didn't matter what the meeting was about. He was always there. And he walked into every single room with this huge folder of overhead slides. And it was always just, dear God, please let David not give that presentation. I worked there for years, and I never saw him actually use any slides, but they were always there, right? and I don't know, maybe he was successful by the very fact that we were all afraid that one day he might show us the slide. But walking into the meeting with a lot of data, is just a powerful thing. My colleague at Michigan, John King, always likes to say, numbers beats no numbers every time. Doesn't matter what the numbers are. So this notion that of signal and symbol begins to sort of, begins to draw our attention to the way that data becomes this highly political object. Now, data in this talk is going to be a political object with both a capital P and a small p. Here it's the sort of small p version of politics. It's to do with sort of the institutional context. It's to do with the ways that city government is structured and operates. Now, it turns out this also begins to overlap with the capital P part. So, I told you that the data team was set up by Mayor Garcetti when he was elected mayor in 2013. And he set up the data team as part of a group called MOBI, which is the Mayor's Office of Budget and Innovation. I'm not quite sure what is being signaled by putting together budget and innovation. Maybe putting together budget and innovation is itself innovative. But the data team lives inside that group. Now, the important thing about that group is that group reports to the mayor. It's part of the mayor's organization within government. It's part of the political function of government. That is distinct from the operational parts of city government, the parking department, the transportation department, the parks department, and so forth, right? They're all there to make sure that things keep going, that the trash gets picked up and the sewers are washed out and the parks are open and somebody's mowing the grass and all those kinds of things. But the political function of government is quite different. The political function, the political part of the city government is responsible, of course, for making sure that everything goes well in the city. But it wants to make sure everything goes well in the city because it wants to make sure that the mayor is in good shape. In fact, the people on the data team are people, because they had been long-time advocates for the sorts of data-driven transparency that they felt could be achieved in the city. They are people who were activists who joined Mayor Garcetti's campaign when he was running for mayor. So they came into the government with the mayor. They presumably expect they will leave government with the mayor. Eric Garcetti is a very accomplished politician. He is a young man There was stories last year that he might try running for the presidency, which would be a very unusual thing to do from a mayor's office, but nonetheless, we might expect to see him move on to other things. What's more, mayors in Los Angeles are term limited, as they are in many places, which means everybody knows he has to go somewhere because he can't stay around. He's now in his second term, but he will move on somewhere, and so everyone is very invested in making sure that that they're A, visible to the mayor, and B, that they are demonstrably pursuing the mayor's objectives. Contrast this, if you will, with what it looks like in the operational part of government. Let's imagine, and I'm just pulling this out the air, this is not based on any data or whatever, I don't know, you're running the parking department. You've been there for 25 years. You've seen a lot of mayors come and a lot of mayors go. When somebody comes down and says, hi, I'm from the 15th floor, I'm from the mayor's office, and I'm here to make sure that you're releasing data about whereabouts in the city you issue parking tickets and when, and whether there are, in order to see whether a machine learning algorithm can determine that you might have quotas, and that, beyond, as we're coming up to quarterly boundaries, you give out more parking tickets. Might not be in your interest to release that information. You might not be super eager to release that information, and maybe you just think if you wait around for long enough, it'll all just go away, because after all, the mayor will have to go away. I'm not saying this happens, by the way, absolutely not. He said, conscious of the microphone and recordings and things like that. But my point is simply that the nature of one's relationship to data and what data does looks very different from the different parts of government. And therefore, the location of the data team as part of the political function of city government rather than the operational function of city government becomes really interesting. The CIO's office is part of the operational part. They're responsible for making sure that the computers work and get backed up and the network's okay and that people have the applications they need and the rest of it. But that's not in the mayor's function. That's not the data team, and that's why this relationship between the data team and the CIO's office is particularly kind of interesting, because it raises these questions about where data lives and where responsibility for data lives. We had a case where the data team has a data portal, which is the place where they make data available to citizens. You can go and browse through all sorts of things. Seattle has one too. And you can, you get all the data there, but it turns out that even the data that's in the portal that's run by the data team, portal's run by the data team, but the data isn't owned by the data team. So we had a case, for instance, where one department had published data through the portal and then took it down again. And it was particularly problematic because it's the police department, and I don't know how much you know about the history of LAPD, but they operate under a large number of Justice Department consent decrees that makes things very messy. And I was such amazed. It's like, how did the police department even manage to take it down? And it's like, well, it turns out all the departments continue to own the data even when the data is in the portal. The data team themselves don't have responsibility for it and actually don't have access except through the portal in the same way that citizens might. But here's another really weird and interesting little wrinkle to this. So you could think about these inside-outside distinctions in terms of the various little units inside the city, but we can also think about them in terms of city government itself. So I told you that many of the people who came in as part of the data team were activists, working, making arguments for data transparency, and then finding in then candidate Eric Garcetti a person who was supportive of their vision and their agenda, and they sort of signed on. But activists, by and large, don't stop being activists when they go and work for the city government, and so many of them also continue to turn up in the evenings for Hack for LA, or Data for Black Lives, and other community groups that are involved in making use of the city's data in order to, for instance, determine differences that in the composition of people who get stopped by the police or whatever it is, right? In fact, many times they're doing the same job from both sides. During the day, they clean up and release the data, and in the evening, they download the data and they engage in other kinds of political activism around that data. So the distinction between the inside and the outside, the who's this data for, how a city government is making data available to people turns out to be much more complicated because it's many of the same people on both sides. Okay. So data, in the sense, so data has its temporalities here in the sense that it is entwined with the temporalities with institutional temporalities, with the history of the city as a bureaucracy, with the anticipation of the pace at which things happen in city government, with the notion of term limits, mayoral elections, transitions in the director of the police department and all the other kinds of things. The data has its own temporality, of course, the rates at which it changes, our expectations about its longevity, the differing sources from which data has been generated that make it difficult for us to compare today's data to data from 10 years ago. But the temporalities of the data have to be read in light of and entwined with the temporalities of the institution as well, because it's the institution that makes the data, right? It's the institution that makes the data live, and those things matter. When we read the city as an organization, we start to see it having this sort of temporal structure in important ways. It also critically has really important visual dimensions. Affective dimensions as well, which I may or may not be able to get to. But one of the things I think we need to sort of bear in mind here is that the primary way in which data becomes available to people is not in the form of aforementioned CSV files, but is in a whole variety of visual forms by which it is shaped and presented to different kinds of audiences and communities. And the most common, across the board, across all the different sort of initiatives of this sort, the most common form of this is that what are often called dashboards. And this is not unique to cities by any means. Universities do this too. This dashboard, for instance, this is from Dublin, and there's a researcher, a professor in Dublin called Rob Kitchen, critical geographer, who's done a lot of work around sort of smart city stuff, and he's been working with the city of Dublin to try to sort of produce, to work on their dashboard. But, the dashboard presents a whole variety of different kinds of elements brought together visually, placed into roughly the same kind of format to show us at a glance something of what happens in the city. I no longer remember now which city this comes from. I've given this talk in various places. I tried to download something that's relevant to the particular place, and I've forgot to keep track of all of them. This is one of my favorites. This is from the city of Melbourne. Is there a pointer in here? Is this going to work? No. The one I will draw your attention to is this one in the middle over here, which is we are told that we have a 6% rise in the number of memberships of recreation centers. I presume that's a good thing. It's green. But it's just like it's not entirely clear to me why stormwater harvesting, number of food premises inspected, and the number of memberships of recreation centers are all to be brought together fungibly in this way. What it is I meant to read into some of these things, but well, it's like John said, numbers beats no numbers every time. So. 5,634. It's a number. I actually went to try to find this stuff for Seattle. Weirdly, if you type Seattle City Dashboard into at least the search engine I use, you are indeed led to a dashboard. Although the dashboard uselessly is telling you about the web traffic statistics for the city of Seattle's. Their website, which is not really terribly helpful. A little more searching around will get you the sort of thing that you normally expect to see. Crime maps in this particular case. This one is interesting. This is data on police use of force incidents and reporting. There's a lot going on in here. I don't quite know what they all mean. I'm not even sure why the use of force totaled by hour is especially relevant, but I don't know. There's a couple of things I want to sort of like point to about these though. As should be reasonably obvious from the way I'm trying to sort of put these things together, drawn as they are from different places and different kinds of technologies, what we see when we look at an array of them is a reliance upon a very particular and standardized set of visual practices. Each of them individually is relying on mechanisms for creating equivalence, for producing equivalence through proximity, through reproduction of particular kinds of visual tropes. They rely obviously on the sort of like, the visual forms of science. They rely also on the visual forms of business analysis. These things begin to look like key KPI, key performance indicators pretty soon. They also rely an enormous amount, as you see, especially at the ones on either side on the top, on this idea that everything is either good or bad. The good things are green, the bad things are red. Sometimes we get it consistent so that up is always good and down is always bad, but that's not clear since there's clearly one of these. Then the one on this Melbourne one where the red down here is bad is the number of days to process planning permit applications. So it's not good for that. Not good for that to go up. So there's a huge amount of commonality here, which is a sort of intriguing problem for the city, if you will. Cities, by and large, are committed to their uniqueness. Cities are committed to their idiosyncrasies. Cities are committed to the idea that they're individual, rather like the crowd in Life of Brian. They're all individuals. So it's like they're committed to that, and indeed they often are. They're very heterogeneous in terms of their structure and their organization, in the role of the mayor and the role of the council and the rest of it. And yet, what we find is this sort of uniformity across them all, which sort of like begins to deny, to a certain extent, the ways in which the cities should be understood independently. One of the reasons for this is fairly obvious, and I alluded to it earlier, which is there's 4 people who work on the data team. There's only so much that they're going to be able to do. They're not technologists. They're data scientists of various sorts. Again, the data scientists tend to be the students who are sort of coming through and disappearing. Leah's work there is as a graphic designer, which, I mean, again, clearly, like, being able to sort of present this data visually is very important to them, which is why they were so eager. I'll tell you the story, actually. We were trying, it's often very difficult to negotiate ethnographic access to somewhere, and so it was with the city for us at first. We would keep having these meetings scheduled that always had to be canceled at the last minute, and we sort of had this feeling we were never going to get in because they just didn't really want us there. And, nevertheless, we persisted. And so eventually, like, we had a meeting that wasn't canceled, and it became patently clear straight away that the reason we'd had so much difficulty before was because there's only 4 of them, and they were very busy. And so they were canceling meetings because there were always other things to do. And so Leah sort of basically lays out what she wants to do, and tells them she's a graphic designer, and she will be able to contribute to that side. And the chief data officer said, yes, this is no problem. Your desk is there, and if you could come to a meeting in 20 minutes in the conference room down the hall where we're meeting with this other department, that would be great. And so it's like, oh, I guess we're just starting then. Let me get my notebook. So they're very eager to, they require these resources, including design resources, but they can't build the technologies. And so the technologies all come from other places, right? The technologies come from Tableau. Maybe people from Tableau here, who knows? The technologies come from IBM and Microsoft and the usual suspects. Those companies are very eager to sell their technologies into Los Angeles because Los Angeles is a very sort of influential node in this sort of smart city network. And if you sell it into Los Angeles, it's going to make it much easier for you to go down the road to Long Beach and sell it to them too, and then, and on down the coast and so forth. And the city desperately requires this stuff, but it has to sort of like buy into it in the way in which the corporation wants to be able to provide it. There's a part of this I'm not going to talk about because I haven't really thought about it enough, but one of the things that people have asked me at various points is whether the corporate relationship to the city is because the corporations are trying to get hold of data about the city, about the city's residents, about city practices, and the rest of it. That may be what the corporations want. Who knows? Interestingly, when this has come up for us, it's actually gone in the other direction. It turned out that the city had to buy from a commercial vendor data on where all the fire hydrants were. They just didn't know. Clearly, they knew once upon a time, and maybe they knew some of them, but it turns out actually that the corporations, particularly sort of in the GIS business, have much more detailed and accurate information about the urban furniture of Los Angeles than Los Angeles does. But the important thing, the thing I really want to stress about these dashboards is actually not so much this part, because I have to say every city, if you dig around enough, as I did with the Seattle, like every city has these. But the point is, that's not the only place where dashboards occur. Dashboards critically are also located inside of government, in particular kinds of places, in meeting rooms, well, actually, they occur in many places, right? So one of the standard places that they will be is a big screen inside the mayor's office so that he can point journalists to it when he's being interviewed. They'll often occur in the lobby of the building so that you've got something to do while you're standing interminably in line to be like, security screened or something. But importantly, they also happen in the meeting rooms and boardrooms where people are actually making decisions. Dashboards are widely deployed at sites of decision making, to the extent that we sort of begin to recognize that, in fact, in many ways, it's the dashboard that's the site of decision-making much more than the data. I'm not looking at numbers. I'm not, drilling down here. I'm looking at trends. We're looking at a sort of broad pattern. Maybe we zoom back and forth in time using some kind of scroll bar. But nonetheless, it's actually the visualization that tells the story, and it's the visualization at which decision-making happens. The data is sort of displaced by its own visual presentation as a site of decision-making. So when we talk about data-driven governance or data-driven, innovation, data-driven organizations, one of the questions I think to ask is just how much the data is actually in focus or even in view. In view or even in focus? Confounded by my own metaphor. All right. I want to go back to this thing that I raised earlier about the people who find themselves on the data team doing this work. As I said, they're the data team, part of the MOBI, the Mayor's Office of Budget and Innovation, part of the mayor's team, part of the political function of government, but very much part of government, right? It's not as though these guys are totally opposed to the people on the operational side. They're all government. And as I've similarly mentioned, the members of the data team, the permanent members of the data team, were largely community organizers, community activists, people who were concerned with policing in the city, people who were concerned with efficiency in the city, people who were concerned with fairness in the city, and who felt that data and data technologies offered an opportunity not only for oversight but also for improvement, and found in Garcetti a sort of convenient a compelling figure who also agreed with them, and a way, therefore, to make change. And they find themselves now, inside the government, charged with responsibility for making that change. And they then have this curious, complicated experience that many of them, that it reflects how many of them move back and forth, between days in City Hall and evenings at LA City College and the other places where some of these groups meet. They find themselves not necessarily able to throw stones and agitate in the same way inside government as they could outside of government. Because after all, they all have to get along. We actually all have, they're there for, 4 years, 5 years, 8 years, whatever. You can't be engaged, you can't have this totally fractious relationship with the infrastructure of the city. You have to be sort of working together towards various kinds of goals. And it's a complicated situation that they find themselves navigating. The metaphor that I found useful is another piece of organizational sociology. It's work by Deborah Meyerson and Maureen Scully. It's actually a whole series of papers, but around the notion of the tempered radical. I'll give you my version of the basic sort of animating model in the first of the papers. So Deborah Meyerson, I can't remember if Scully was too, but Meyerson certainly was a professor at the business school at Stanford. And the paper is largely written from the point of view of someone trying to work through the question, I'm a leftist, I'm a feminist, and I'm working in the business school at Stanford. How does that work? It's sort of like, it's animated by these sorts of anxieties and angsts. The notion of the tempered radical, oh, hold on, I've got the quote here. The notion of the tempered radical is someone who is committed to their organization, but also committed to an ideology or a set of values that are not necessarily shared by that organization. Not, to a greater or lesser degree, they might be slightly out of line, they might be radically opposed to each other, and who then have to try to find a way through the moral thicket that they have found themselves in. And they sort of they talk through in that paper a whole variety of ways that people have of trying to do that. A strategy of small wins, being able to I can't necessarily achieve my grand goal of that overthrow of capitalism, but I can nonetheless, do smaller things that seem to sort of be places where my values can be expressed. I can try to produce good in others or create spaces to protect others who also share my value system so that they don't get excluded from the community as a whole. All sorts of kind of things like this. But at the same time, they're also subject to all sorts of other kinds of pressures. The danger, right, of being labeled a sellout. By their not by their peers in the organization, but by their by their friends and others who sort of who live within the in the value system that they do. The danger always of being co-opted, of finding that one has gone over to the dark side, if you will, or just of being very isolated, of finding yourself in an organization that, even if other people do hold your views, doesn't express your views, and so there's a sense of isolation. And so Meyerson and Scully sort of, again, starts off as just what it is to be a leftist feminist in a business school, but it then starts to sort of go, they sort of use this same framework to talk about a variety of other kinds of ways in which people might find themselves in those situations. I don't know, environmentalists who work for United Airlines or something, whatever. And we find many of the same kinds of things going on here in the city for a group of people who are committed to the idea of using data as a tool to hold government to account, but can't necessarily, at least to the degree they might wish to, actualize that notion of account within their daily practice. Now, I should note as well, we have many instances in the fieldwork where what seems to be an oppositional, or what is perceived in advance to probably be an oppositional relationship to some part of government turns out not to be, right? The meeting in which they discovered that the police department was actually super eager to put all their data online, which they kind of like, just like flabbergasted people. This notion that, you know, it's not, the oppositions are not straightforward. And I don't really want to sort of focus on the oppositions. I want to focus more perhaps on the values within which the sort of data and data work gets embedded. Some of those are personal values, some of them are institutional values, some of them are organizational values. They may or may not align, or they may align to differing degrees. So, thank you. Somebody open the door. So there's, you know, talking about like sort of the notion of data as engagement, data as a way that the city is going to engage with its citizenry, but we can also sort of think of data in terms of its positionalities. What sorts of positions does one's relationship to data allow one to occupy? Institutionally, politically, with a small p, politically with a capital P, you know, organizationally, in terms of, you know, professionally, and so forth. What is the sort of space of sort of subject positions that get opened up around data? And again, I'm talking about data. I should have even, maybe I should have data with a small p and data with, or small d. It would be peta, otherwise that wouldn't work. You know, don't mean data in terms of, like, again, raw numbers or sensor readings. I mean sort of this notion, this symbolic notion of data, this thing that we value, that we hold dear, that we believe is our tool. So I'll wind up quickly, and then maybe I'll skip that one altogether. So yeah, so we went into this with an interest in data work, in what it is that people do to make, to work with data in the city, what the problems are that they face, how the technological problems might or might not be bound up with the institutional problems. We went in also, I have to say, right, we went in from a perspective very much that we thought the really interesting thing we were going to be able to get at was the question of how it was that citizens get enrolled or not, and how it is that